Okay, knowing that people will be joining us probably for the next few minutes or so, we are going to go ahead and get started.
And I did just see a question in the chat. So you are all muted and your cameras are off. So we can only see names and that's it. So hello, my name is Kathy Lee. I'm the Assistant Education Director for ADL in San Diego in Arizona. And I really wanted to be part of this webinar today because I want to be part of the change that's happening in our country right now. I'm hopeful that after this hour together, each of you will walk away with some additional confidence to examine some bias in your world, call it out when you see it, and join me in being an active ally.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Kelsey Greenberg-Young, and I am the Education Director for the San Diego ADL office. And I'm really here today because as a white person, it is my responsibility to take on every opportunity I can to help dismantle the system of racism that I know I myself am a part of. And we're going to dive deeper into that a bit as we go. But before we do, I do want to make sure everybody joining us is familiar with the ADL, who we are, and what we do. So for anybody who doesn't know, ADL is a 107-year-old anti-hate organization. We have always had the same mission. It is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. Now, we work on that in a few main areas, the three being we investigate. We investigate hate and hate crimes and extremism, both in person and online. And we also advocate. We advocate for laws and policies focusing on creating that justice. We lobby, write amicus briefs, advocate for community action, and stand in coalition with marginalized communities to fight for civil rights and marriage equality, immigration reform, religious freedom, free speech, hate crimes legislation, criminal justice reform, and voting rights. But most importantly, in my opinion, is our work in education. Now, the foundation for our work in education is understanding the way that hate and bias escalate when left unchecked. And that unpacking the concept that intentional action at an individual level, especially when done at a wide scale, can have an impact on the systems that biased attitudes and biased acts uphold. And we have a few other goals as well. Kathy, you are on mute.
Thank you. So we work closely with schools, administrators, teachers, families, and students to help create campuses that challenge bias and bullying and promote respect, inclusion, and celebrate their diversity. We mostly do this work through our general anti-bias programs and trainings. And one tool that we always use to start off our trainings is called the basic premises. I'm not going to share them all with you today, but I wanted to pull out a few that are particularly relevant to this conversation. So as we move through this session, I ask that you listen and contribute while holding these truths. That bias is universal. It exists within all of us. Change is a process. It really doesn't happen overnight. Diversity is a strength. And prejudice is learned and therefore can and should be challenged. So, as I already said, we can't see your faces today. So I don't know how you all identify yourselves, but we want you to know where we're coming to this conversation from. So we're living in a very unique time, a time of pandemics. Most of our worlds have been in flux, flipping upside down in all directions for 3 months now, I think, and it's mostly due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But we're also in a critical moment of a movement. The murder of George Floyd at the hands of a police officer in broad daylight with people watching from around the world has really brought about a spark of change. This country was built on racial injustice. There is a painful legacy of enforcing systemic biases, dehumanizing Black and brown people, and perpetuating immoral practices that have persisted for centuries. But we can be part of a change. So this conversation today, as a white ally, I'm coming to it not with what I can do, but what I must do, what we all must do. Over the last couple of weeks, we've had many conversations, mostly from the white community, who told us that the next step that we should take is to have the Black community tell us what they need. And what we consistently hear from leaders in our Black community is that it's up to us to do the work on ourselves. We need to examine our relationship with systemic racism and how we may be perpetuating it. We need to educate ourselves. We need to listen to Black experiences. We need to understand that we're most likely going to make mistakes, but the fear of making those mistakes should not stop us from doing something. We will go deeper into all of this later in the session, but I felt like it was important to say, as Kelsey and I are two white women, we are both still working on how to be anti-racist. And I thank you all for joining us on that journey today. We will spend the first half of our hour together starting the conversation about bias and how to recognize bias when we see it. This will help us start recognizing it within ourselves, because in order to truly be an active ally, we must first put in work on ourselves, reflect on our own identities, and then we'll be able to be allies for others. And remember that this is only the start of the conversation. We'll be sending lots of resources to you in a follow-up email, but we also are going to be putting them in the chat session throughout the day. And you'll be able to click on them within the chat, and they'll pop up in another browser so that you can read through them later, because our follow-up email most likely won't go out until Monday. And I encourage you to read through and explore these resources and then share them with your networks. The second half of our hour together, we will share tools and ways to be an ally specifically to the Black community at this time. We're hoping that there'll be enough time for a brief Q&A at the end. So feel free to use the chat to send us questions. You'll find, most of you already found the chat, but in case you haven't, the button is in the lower right-hand side of your screen. And you can notice that once you have the chat open, you can change the recipient so that it just goes to myself and Kelsey as panelists, or to everybody that is on the webinar today. And as noted in the chat, this webinar is being recorded. And with the follow-up email, we will send the recording, and feel free to share the recording out as well. So we're going to be asking you to contribute and engage with us today. So as you already are, please continue using the chat. We're also going to be using the poll function throughout our session. And when the poll function pops up, it will pop up on your screen. And it allows everybody to anonymously answer some questions. So thank you all for joining us today for this important first step. And to start us off, talking about bias, it's important to understand the definitions and how they manifest in our lives.
Thank you, Kathy. So we're going to start off with even just defining bias on a very high level. Bias is a preference for or against an individual or a group that interferes with our impartial judgment. Now, I'm going to break down two specific types of bias and how they are different, and then we're going to talk about the ways they show up. First, we have explicit bias. Explicit bias is the conscious attitudes, stereotypes, and overt intentional actions that we have towards a member of a group simply because they are a member of that group. And that bias can be both positive or negative. We also have implicit bias, which I'm sure we've been hearing a lot about on the news. Implicit bias is really the unconscious attitudes, stereotypes, and actions that we have toward a member of a group simply because they are a member of that group. But these implicit biases are developed through the course of our lives. They come from a variety of messages that are both direct and indirect and taught to us through a variety of ways. And when people act on those biases, they might not even be aware they're doing it. And in fact, implicit bias might be in direct contradiction to an explicit value or belief you have as a person. Now, I'm going to give a couple examples. If my nephew and niece, they both ask me for a new toy, and they both say they'd like a doll. They both like a doll from me. And I tell my nephew that he has to choose another toy because dolls are not for boys. That is an example of explicit bias. I'm consciously aware of and intentionally acting on an attitude and a stereotype I have about boys and girls. Now, for implicit bias, I'm actually going to ask you to help me out on this one. In a minute, I'm going to be sharing a list of words or phrases, and I want you to put in the chat the first word you think of when I say that word or phrase. So if I say peanut butter, please put the first word that came to your mind. Yes, so we see in the chat, almost everyone is saying jelly, right? Quick association. I see a couple toasts too. So you immediately had that connection. Let's try another one. What about if I say knife, fork, and what? Spoon. We see spoon, 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 all the way through the chat. Let's try a little harder one. If I say surf and, what do you say? Turf. Turf, 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 turf. We see a couple other ones, sand, etc. But on a high level, a lot of folks said turf. Let's do one more. If I say salt, you think what? Pepper. Right. Now, these are associations we are able to make quickly without really thinking about it, and they're not consciously or purposely things that we're assigning ideas or values to. But we do it anyway, and it was fast, and it was, although not every single person, pretty ubiquitous. And those associations are based off of those messages we received throughout our lives. And although these examples were fairly innocuous, when we unintentionally assign value, associations, traits, ideas, and stereotypes to members of a particular identity and act on those associations without even thinking about it, that's the implicit bias as we just defined to you a minute ago. Now let's do a quick recap. Explicit bias. Biases that we are aware we have, we're acting on voluntarily, and we're maintaining intentionally. Implicit bias. Bias that we are unaware we have, are acting on involuntarily, and maintaining unintentionally. Now, our ADL moderator is going to put that into the chat for you all to reference here quickly in a minute, because we're going to have you go through some more examples as they relate to bias that manifests towards the Black community. We're going to have you use the polling feature to decide if you think, is this an example of explicit bias or implicit bias? Let's start with our first one. During a baseball game, a Black outfielder on the opposing team is called a racial slur and has peanuts thrown at him by a fan of the home team. Is this an example of explicit bias or implicit bias? Kathy, can you please launch the poll? I see some folks putting it in the chat, which I love, but use the poll feature, it's fun. We're going to give it just 10 seconds or so for everyone to vote, or to as many people as we can to vote. And then we'll show the results. All right, we're getting perfect. So most of you said explicit bias. And we agree. This is an example of explicit bias. The choice to use a slur, the decision to use that against someone who is Black, to understand that the understanding of what throwing things, particularly peanuts, what message that is sending toward that Black player, is a bias that the outfielder and the fan are aware they have, and they are intentionally choosing to act upon. A slur is a pretty textbook example of explicit bias. Let's try another one using the poll feature again. People with stereotypically African American names are less likely to get a job interview than people with stereotypically white names. What do we think, explicit or implicit? Give it another 5 seconds or so for folks to put in their vote. Great. Right, so most of you said implicit, and we agree. Aside from an explicitly biased hiring manager, which of course those people exist, the tendency to skip over, not look closely at, or assign different value to a resume or the interview answers of a Black candidate is not something that is usually intentional or something that someone is conscious of. And yet, let's do another one. As people are gathering in the conference room for a staff meeting, a coworker tells a stereotypical joke about Black people. What do we think, implicit or explicit? We'll give it about 10 seconds. Okay, so most of you voted explicit. We agree. The coworker was aware of the stereotype of that joke, and they were voluntarily sharing it with others, that stereotype that they held through that joke. The message being shared about Black people, the message they were conveying was very intentional. Let's do another one. A student reports that there is an armed Black man in a student center on campus. When security arrives at the scene, they discover that the report was made because a Black student had a glue gun, which he was using for a class project. What do we think, explicit or implicit? Another 5 seconds or so. So this one was a little more split, but most of you also agreed that it's implicit. And we agree. Yes, the student chose to call security, but the question here is why? The implicit bias at play is that Black men are associated with danger and threats. And so the reason they saw something dangerous instead of just the glue gun that was in his hand was the ingrained messages we have been receiving throughout our lives about Black men. And although we cannot be sure, of course, this situation was likely impacted by a bias that the student wasn't even aware they had. But regardless, the impact on that student of having security called on them, whether or not the person who called the security guards was aware of it or not, was the same. Let's do another one. At your child's graduation party, you hear one of their Black friends sharing they will be attending Harvard. Another parent asks, wow, how did you get into that school? Implicit or explicit bias? About 5 more seconds. Yes, so most of you said this was implicit bias. We agree. The bias at play here is unlikely to have been shared intentionally to belittle the student. The parent is probably even unaware that their surprise is based on or confirms these messages that we hear that Black people are less likely to achieve. And yet, again, the impact on that friend is the same. Want another one? As you start driving through a predominantly Black neighborhood, your passenger absentmindedly locks the car door. What do we think, implicit or explicit? About 5 more seconds. Okay. Most of you said implicit. We agree. Notice the word absent-mindedly. Now, if that passenger had said out loud, oh, wow, this is a Black neighborhood, we should lock our doors, this example might have been an explicit one instead. But the fact that some message or some feeling prompted them to think this neighborhood all of a sudden was unsafe is very likely due to an implicit bias based off of years of exposure to messages that areas that have Black people in them are dangerous, and prompted this passenger to react without even thinking about it and without the intention to display the message they did. Let's do one more. When signing up for a neighborhood potluck, someone asks a Black neighbor, will you bring the fried chicken? Immediately after he says, just joking. What do we think? Implicit or explicit? About 5 more seconds. Okay, so most of you voted explicit, and we agree. Similar to the earlier joke, this neighbor is aware of their stereotype for the Black community. Not only are they aware of it, they purposefully went out of their way to share it. And the addition of just joking does not undo the fact that this is an example of explicit bias. Now, I want to acknowledge the fact that some of these examples, some of the answers, you might have disagreed with. There was some variation in some of these. And some of them just might have been hard to decide. And that's okay. The thing I want you to take away from this exercise is this. These are just some of the examples of the lived experience of Black people in the United States. So does it really matter if that bias was explicit or implicit to the impact that it has on their lives? Whether or not that bias is intentional or unintentional, as allies, does it matter to the community that is being targeted, whether or not it was on purpose? Let me be clear. If as a hiring manager, I purposely put aside a name that sounds stereotypically African-American, or I unconsciously skip over it because of some feeling I have about that resume, the impact on the community is the same. They're not getting the jobs they deserve because of my bias. It really doesn't matter whether we say it's explicit or implicit bias, because we have the responsibility to become aware of implicit biases and challenge them, just as we have the responsibility to challenge explicit bias when we see it, and vice versa. Bias is something that we all have, like Kathy shared. It is universal in all of us. But the more we can become aware of it and look at it, the more we can counteract it in ourselves. And the more we talk about it in groups like these, the more tools we're going to have at our disposal to disrupt it. More on that later. Because first, now that we have started to examine how bias manifests, we want to take a minute to look a little inward. Recognizing that bias shows up based off of our own lived experiences, we're going to ask you to go through another exercise with us. Kathy.
All right. So I'm going to ask you all, remember that we can't see you, so this is going to be something that's just for you. So I'm going to ask you all to hold up your hands like this. And we're going to read a series of statements. So I would like you to please put up a finger. Oh, you can barely see that with my virtual background. So you put up a finger if that statement is true for you. So you start putting up fingers. If you're around other people and would prefer to do this privately, you can always grab a piece of paper and then just make tally marks or keep a count in your head, but please do try to keep track. All right. So the first statement. I can easily find picture books, postcards, toys, and dolls that feature people of my race. So if that is true for you, you can put up a finger. Television and movies routinely depict people of my race in a wide range of positive roles. I can arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. I am certain that I need legal or if I need legal or medical help, my race will not negatively impact me getting that assistance. I can do well in a challenging situation without being perceived as a credit to my race or an exception to the rule.
I can be late to a meeting without having that lateness reflect my race. I am never asked to speak for all the people of my racial group. I can take a job with an affirmative action policy without my coworkers or peers assuming that I got it because of my race. I can go shopping without concerns that store employees will follow me and or monitor my actions because of my race. Children in my racial group do not need to be educated about systematic racism for their daily physical safety. Now, does anybody want to take a guess in the chat what this exercise represents? That's right, privilege. Specifically, white privilege. Now, let me make sure that we define privilege. Privilege is a group of unearned and often unseen, unrecognized advantages or rights given to people simply because of their membership in a dominant group. And they can be obvious, but they can also be less obvious, unspoken advantages that people in the dominant group might not even recognize. So it differentiates it a bit from things like overt bias or prejudice. It also includes just pure affirmation from our culture that we have worth and the freedom to play, work, live, speak freely. Now, let me be clear. Privilege is not limited to race. Being white, Christian, male, heterosexual, able-bodied, college-educated, middle class, having a gender expression that that matches the societal norms, all fall into a list of identities that receive preferential treatment because of their dominant group membership, and are often used as the norm to compare other groups with as a standard and making them othered. But today, in the context of being an ally to the Black community, we're specifically talking about race. And as Kathy said, I recognize that not everybody on this call, I don't know your identity. And so if you are looking at your fingers or your tally marks and you see 7, 8, 9, 10 fingers up, you might be feeling a certain way right now. And if you see significantly less than that in your tally marks or your fingers, you also might be feeling a certain way right now. So I see some people chatting, but let's take a minute to just process how you're feeling right now about reflecting on your personal experience with privilege. Share 2 words maybe in the chat. How are you feeling? I see sad, guilt, aware, grateful and sad, more aware, guilty, that I can be an ally, terrible, clarity, learning to not be afraid, open-minded, indifferent, asleep, aware and a hunger to use for good, not surprised, change it. So you can keep reading those and reflecting yourself, thank you. But I appreciate you sharing your candid thoughts. I want to also share that reflection on privilege isn't about making you feel guilty. It isn't about making you feel guilty or about making you feel sad. Rather, it's about recognizing that the responsibility that we have to be an ally in the context we are talking about today. An ally is someone who has privilege, but chooses to stand for or stand with marginalized communities by taking tangible, ongoing actions to dismantle systems of oppression. So now that we have spent a little time exploring some of the ways that bias is impacting the Black community, reflected on how our privilege relates to that bias, and now how it relates to being an ally, let's switch gears and dive into how that new awareness can be used for us to be allies today.
So communities around the world have taken to social media and the streets to protest unlawful and unjust treatment that occurs based on race. The United States has deep history of racism and oppression, like we briefly touched on. And while some progress has been made, explicit and implicit racism exists. Angela Davis, in my opinion, said this best when she said, "In a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. Deconstructing implicit biases, preconceived notions about race, and working to educate yourself on relevant matters are steps that we can all be taking to be more active advocates against racial injustice." But I want to share with you 10 specific ways that you can be an ally to the Black community today. Listen. So listen to what the Black community is saying on social media, in the news, in your neighborhood, in articles that you read. Recognize that it's not about you, your feelings, or your opinions, or your emotions. It's about hearing theirs. Educate yourself. Take a look at your bookshelf. Take a look at your Netflix queue. Are your books and movies written or produced by people of color? If not, change that. Seek out books, articles, films, etc. about the history of racial injustice in this country, but also the current issues that we're facing. Read them, watch them, learn from them, but most importantly, share them out with your networks. Get involved. Maybe join a local protest. Expand who you follow on social media. Subscribe to some new email lists, perhaps the NAACP, or the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights, or the National Urban League. And then show up to support their work. When somebody from the Black community invites you to an event, go. Be there to listen, to learn, to show your support, and also seek out opportunities to support Black artists and Black-owned businesses. Speak up. Hold difficult conversations. When a friend, a family member, a coworker, or a stranger says something hateful, call them out. Silence allows oppression to continue. So you may ask yourself, or me, so how do I do that? And after I go through these 10, I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into that. Intervene. When someone is being targeted physically or verbally, intervene only with their permission. Focus, and then when you do intervene, focus on supporting them as a target rather than engaging the aggressor. Welcome discomfort. When you encounter something that makes you uncomfortable, don't dismiss it. Instead, lean into it and ask yourself why it makes you feel that way, and welcome it as an opportunity to grow. Learn from your mistakes. You will make mistakes. We all make mistakes. When someone calls you out, try not to get defensive. Breathe, listen, apologize, and then change your behavior moving forward. Stay engaged. Even when the work gets difficult, stay engaged. Racism is constant, and Black people do not have the privilege of turning off. Donate. Commit to financially support a local or national organization that focuses on this work. And don't just donate once, make it an ongoing donation. All right, so now that you have this list of 10 ways to be an ally in front of you, I'm going to ask you to think about which 2 or 3 that you can commit to doing starting today? And remember that this is just start. And if you've already are doing these things, which 2 or 3 are you going to start doing? And I would like you to, some of you are already doing this, put that in the chat. Make a commitment, demonstrate it, and put it out there for all of us to read. And hopefully it will keep you accountable. Awesome. So keep putting those in there. Which 2 or 3?
I'm seeing a wide range of these, Kathy. People are going through a variety, but a lot of the ones I'm seeing are educate a lot, and speak up, listen, donate, get involved, intervene, learn from my mistakes. Yeah. All of them, I see basically all of them from someone, so that's great.
Wonderful, that is great. All right. So I mentioned that we're going to dive a little bit deeper into how to hold difficult conversations, how to talk about race in particular. So before we dive into that, I first would like to do a poll. And this poll is about assessing your comfort level on talking about racism. And there's going to be a series of statements that pop up. And I would like you to select the one, as I read them aloud, select the one that really resonates with how you feel in this moment. So go ahead and launch the poll. I would rather not talk about race or racism. I am very uncomfortable talking about race or racism. I am usually uncomfortable talking about race and racism. I am sometimes uncomfortable talking about race and racism. I am usually comfortable talking about race and racism. I'm very comfortable. So we're going to let the poll stay open for about another 15 seconds or so. All right, do we want to end the poll? All right, so as you can see, not everybody is incredibly comfortable talking about race and racism, and that's okay. That's why we're here today. We're making that first step. So I have some reflection homework for you to do. Not that we're gonna get back together as a group, but still. So here are 2 sentence starters. And I invite you to write these down or take a picture of them. We'll also be including that or we'll include these sentence starters in the follow-up email with our resources. But I challenge you to spend some time this weekend trying to answer them. So they are: the hard part of talking about race and racism is, the beneficial part of talking about race and racism is. And then after you've done some reflection on these, go start having these conversations. So as you have these, you move into these conversations, as you approach these conversations, I have put together a couple of tips for you. So these tips are to be respectful. Approach each conversation, whether it's with your friends, your family, your coworkers, or strangers, with respect and an open heart. Respect for its weightiness and the nuance, respect for the centuries of pain and oppression, respect for multiple perspectives and narratives, respect for the person you are engaging with, even if they are bringing different viewpoints to the conversation. Coming from a respectful place that is open and willing to listen and learn, it really goes a long way to diffuse any potential conflict before it arises. Everyone wants to be heard. So acknowledging what they are saying, trying to find one piece, even if it's a really small piece that you can validate, that will help bring those defensive walls down. Be vulnerable. You don't have all the answers. That's okay. We're not expected to be experts. So put aside fear and acknowledge that we are coming to this conversation to grow and learn together. Ask questions. Remember that conversations are meant to be a dialogue rather than a debate. Commit yourself to change. As we've stated throughout this session, we all have bias. What will make a difference is acknowledging these biases and then working to deconstruct them. When I say something without thinking and when it comes out and I hear my white privilege or my implicit bias in that statement, I acknowledge it as part of the conversation. I own up to it because it's okay to make mistakes as long as we call them out, even if we're calling ourselves out, because that's how we grow. Be accountable. So speak up when you hear someone else's bias. I find an easy way to do this usually is by asking them a question, like, what makes you say that? Are you speaking about a specific incident or experience? What do you mean by that? By asking questions, it helps to kind of open up the conversation to address bias without, and leaving their defensive walls down because you're just asking a question rather than telling them they said something wrong. Sometimes I don't feel like asking a question, so I say things like, ooh, that hurts, or ouch. Saying something, even if it's not perfect, is always better than letting a problematic comment slide, letting it go unchecked. Reflect. Try to put your preconceptions aside. This doesn't mean personal experiences aren't valid. It simply acknowledges that personal experience can't possibly give you the complete view of such a complex issue. The history of racism encompasses years and years of both individual and community lived experience. So try to come to conversations understanding that you cannot possibly understand someone else's lived experience. And try to internalize what you learn. So facts alone don't often change people's views. It's easy to hear something new and in the moment be convinced of its truth and its impact, and then days later kind of revert back to our previous knowledge. So it's not merely enough to read and to talk about race, to hear about race. It's important to make an effort to apply these changes to your frame of thinking and your actions. And then bring what you learn to your next conversation. So reflection on these conversations is an important piece. So maybe journal about it so that next time you can approach this conversation with a wider lens. So these tips hopefully will help navigate conversations about race. But you may notice that all of them have something to do with looking inward, examining ourselves so that we can come to these conversations with a mindset that really helps to keep defenses down and leave both parties open to dialogue. Thinking about our role in racism is important to understanding our role in helping to dismantle it. There's a quote that I came across recently that I really liked and I want to share it with you. It's, on our way to new knowledge, we have to resign from a place of comfort and embrace the discomfort of not having all the answers. All right, so I also kind of wanted to dig just a little bit deeper on staying engaged. So, here's a slide with a few non-ADL resources. So some ways to use these resources to stay engaged, maybe host, like start up a book club or change the topic of your current book club. And read a book about racial justice and then talk about it with your book club. I recently noticed last night on Netflix that when I logged in, something popped up that showed me they've created a collection of films all about racial justice in this country. So they've already done the work for us. They've put it together in a nice package. Watch those films, maybe host a Netflix watch party. And then talk about them. So those are a couple of ideas on how to stay engaged. So if we look at this resource slide, so read this book if you're an adult. It's called So You Want to Talk About Race. We're also going to include a lot of other book lists in the resources that we send out. The Hate You Give is a wonderful book to read with your teenagers. Or if you have a young child, Something Happened in Our Town is a great one. On Netflix right now is 13th. Highly recommend watching that film. And if you're into podcasts, New York Times has a wonderful one called 1619. And then in the last couple of weeks, the National Museum of African American History and Culture released an amazing resource called Talking About Race. And I think we're gonna stick that in the chat momentarily so you can explore that this weekend. ADL also has some really great resources. So those resources, Kelsey. So we have a collection of resources that's titled George Floyd, Racism and Law Enforcement in English and in Spanish. And it's a collection of lesson plans and blogs and table talks, which are like family conversation guides. An example of one of those lesson plans is Black Lives Matter, from hashtag to movement. Or make your school, if you're connected to a school, look into making it a No Place for Hate school, which is our program that focuses on challenging bias and bullying on campus. So thank you all for joining us to start this conversation today. I hope it was useful, a useful way to spend an hour. And I do really appreciate your time. Moving forward, I encourage you to remember those 2 or 3 ways that you put into the chat of what you are committing to do from now on to be an active ally. It looks like we do have a few minutes for questions. So I think what we're going to do to help us navigate the chat is to change it over so that you, all of your chat will just go to Kelsey and myself. And we will try to grab a question or 2 to answer.
Easy question. Will this recording be sent out? Yes. Absolutely. And in reference to even the resources mentioned, all of those will also be sent out along with it, so you can share. I'm seeing just lots of thank yous, which we really appreciate. More commitments for what you're going to be doing. How do you stand up to somebody who is the target of racism without going against the persecutor? Okay, I'll take that question. So one of the ways, I mean, I do believe that you should be saying things to folks who are the perpetuators of bias and biased comments toward a targeted community, but I share that I recognize that sometimes you can't. I do know that, and I would never pretend like every opportunity allows you to interact with the perpetrator, the aggressor in that situation. So something you can always do is be an ally to the person on the other end of that bias, that target. Ask them how they're feeling, ask them how they're doing, check in and show love and support right now in general with our Black colleagues and friends, and share that you're thinking of them, and see if there's just something you can do. Being seen when you have been targeted with something that makes you feel unseen can have an impact. So that would be my answer to that one.
So there are lots of questions coming in, and I'm trying to read them as they come in. So here's a question. You talked about bias manifesting, and we all have it. How can we disrupt that when biases come from the media? So that's a really great question. I mean, you can always reach out directly to whichever company you heard this bias come from. And they usually have an HR department or a manager that you can reach out to and express to them what you're witnessing and how it is causing harm. Because the more that we hold them accountable, the better. And if we don't say anything, it will continue to happen. So I would suggest reaching out specifically to that organization to express your discomfort or your anger with what you witnessed.
I also would add to that part of media literacy is sitting with people in your lives and looking at the words that are being used. Bias that comes from the media ends up being internalized by folks without us really thinking about it, right? When we talk about implicit bias. So especially if you're thinking about young people in your life, but it can be anybody in your life, sit and analyze the words. What are the words being used when referencing somebody who is white versus somebody who is Black? And ask yourself the question of who benefits from the way this statement was said, who is being targeted by the way this statement was said, and how would we have said it? So although it doesn't actually stop a media source from saying what they did, it allows a conversation with the people in your own life to unpack it.
Great. Here's another one. So somebody asked me to comment on the intervene with why do you need to wait for or get permission. So I think that that's an important piece because we never want to speak for somebody else. So if they are being targeted, but they feel like they have it under control, I don't want to step in and speak on their behalf unless I have the permission from them to do so. I don't want to overstep my bounds, so that's why I put the permission piece in, because I never want to speak on somebody else's behalf without them saying it's okay.
I see a comment that asks, have you thought about including Black voices within this presentation as moderators? And the answer is of course, absolutely. We are working in this context right now of elevating Black voices and making sure Black voices are heard, while also recognizing that racism was not created by Black people. Racism was created by white people. And as Kathy shared in the beginning of this session, something we are hearing over and over and over again from Black voices are that it is our responsibility as white people to have these conversations, rather than always putting the burden on our Black friends and family and colleagues to explain our privilege and explain our bias and explain what we need to be doing. And so that's one of the reasons we chose today to speak to you as two white women. And of course, as is being asked as well, we are looking at the resources being shared and making sure that they are uplifting those Black voices. We are working with our Black colleagues when they choose to be part of this with us, but again, taking that responsibility ourselves, because racism uplifts white people, and thus it is our job to dismantle it.
I think that that's kind of a nice way to end. The questions have stopped populating right now. I'm sure I missed a ton of them. I'm so sorry. There's just so much here, and we will definitely take some time and look through the chat and try to address anything that we can in the follow-up email.
Yep. And so you see our contact information on the screen. We are accessible to you all if you'd like to email, reach out, ask for a resource. If we don't have the answer for you, we will try and find it. And we're here as a resource in the community if we're all trying to figure out how best to continue this work. Because as Kathy shared, change is a process. This is not going to happen overnight. And so we have to keep engaging in this conversation as long as we can, and as long as is needed, which sadly I'm afraid will be a very long time. But with that, I would like to share an ending quote with you all that kind of gives us a little bit of perspective of why we're having these conversations, which is, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not to be lived again. So I hope that you can keep the context of what we shared here today along with that quote as you move into your weekend. Please look for an email from us early next week. And we appreciate you all so much for joining us for this hour on your Friday. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.